In this week's Shadow Talk, the team gear up to wade in on the topic of phishing. With our Fisheye lens, we take a look at email phishing developments and reporting over the past year, highlighting the most popular techniques that organizations and individuals need to be aware of. We'll discuss nation-state actors to novice cybercriminals, and how the techniques used by actors on both ends of the scale differ very little. Finally, our security engineering team will point out key process and training tips to help you stay clear of murky waters. All this to come on Shadow Talk. Hello and welcome to Shadow Talk. I'm your host, Rafael Amado, and joining me we had Simon Hall, Senior Security Engineer here at Digital Shadows. Hey, Simon.
Hey, Raf, how you doing?
Very good, thanks. And once again, we have Richard Gold, Director of Security Engineering.
Hey, Raf, I'm doing very well, thanks. Yourself?
Yeah, good. Gearing up for Christmas. Should be a nice short break for most of us, but a good break nonetheless. So this week we published an extended blog looking at the most popular phishing techniques used by actors of all persuasions. The blog draws out the social engineering tricks detailed in some of the big indictments that we previously talked about. So here we mention the GRU and the North Korean programmer cases, highlighting some of the most effective techniques preferred by, let's say, some of the more sophisticated actors. And then as well as this, the research looks at what more low-level cyber criminals are discussing and sharing on the various social engineering and phishing sub-forums that they're present on, both on cybercriminal forums and messaging applications. And what we learn is that these actors are all trying to emulate the same type of phishing techniques, be it social engineering lures on LinkedIn and Twitter, or email spoofing techniques, obviously to varying degrees of success. Now, Simon and Richard will help me unpack this research today, and they're best placed to give us some nice mitigation tips at the end of it as well. So my first question is, the InfoSec community has done a relatively good job at protecting systems. I mean, emphasis on relatively. But why is it that organizations and individuals still struggle to combat phishing threats?
I think phishing itself, or just email in general, the whole SMTP protocols and everything else around email, to be honest, is pretty ancient now. There's been no real massive improvements in email protocols or SMTP or anything else, and we're still using the same kind of postfix servers underneath or whatever else. So there's been bolt-ons, kind of, you look at the SPFs and DMARC solutions and stuff like this, but all of they're just patchwork trying to cover holes in this kind of legacy protocol. So I think for organizations, it's pretty difficult. You've got to go out there and buy separate solutions to try and fix specific holes within your kind of email solution. So it's hard to know where to start and where to stop and what solutions you should actually buy for this.
Yeah, I would say the other thing is that phishing is really a form of social engineering, and it's targeting human weaknesses, human fallibilities. Now, we're all human. We all have our own predispositions. We're all, built kind of the same way, more or less. We're social primates, and phishing takes direct advantage of that. Things like putting urgency onto people, making them feel like they're under time pressure or under some kind of social pressure. It's exploiting our nature rather than exploiting a buffer overflow vulnerability.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there is, as you say, there's only so much you can actually do to actually resolve issues around social engineering. That comes down to kind of security awareness and heighten people's senses to these sort of issues. And with phishing, it becomes, I don't know, it's quite difficult, because I think everybody is, something I like to say, that everybody is susceptible to phishing with the right context or the right law. There's a lot of people out there who have a high opinion of themselves, who claim they'll never get caught by a phishing campaign, and everyone else that does is dumb, which is totally not the case. It only takes the person to kind of profile you and find out the right context to actually get a successful phish.
And so also for these people, how would they know that they've actually been successfully phished? Most people don't realize it. So it's such a ridiculous statement, in my opinion.
So we'll come on to the trade-offs, or at least the different ways of combating phishing, whether it's training, user awareness, and then more process and the controls that you can put in. But I want to pick up on something both of you have talked about in terms of how phishing or phishers exploit elements of human nature. look at our habits and try and play off those as well. So in both the GRU and North Korean programmer indictments, we read how these supposedly nation state level hackers or attackers opted to use phishing links and pages impersonating Facebook, LinkedIn, Gmail account notifications to achieve their initial intrusion. Then if we look on a whole host of cybercriminal forums, even those for novice phishers, we see individuals selling social media templates, tutorials for performing these exact same type of attacks. Now, are you surprised that the techniques used, or at least being discussed across both these areas, are largely the same?
Not at all. I mean, phishing is phishing. I mean, the key difference is the success rate, right? So when you look at the nation states, they know what they're doing. They've got the manpower to do that kind of human intelligence side of things, to actually profile an organization or an individual, to generate a lure that's actually going to work for that organization. Whereas these novice groups or individuals, like, I mean, when you look at the general mail spam stuff, like the sextortion campaigns that we've covered a few times now, these are high volume, kind of low impact fish. So they'll send them out to like 1.4 billion. If we look at the some of these lists that are out there, and they'll get a handful of people. Whereas a nation state will spend a lot of time, or just an APT group, for instance, will spend a lot of time profiling an organization to know what's more likely to work. And it comes down to like the configurations of some of these campaigns as well. And the novices, they'll look at these guides online and say, okay, this is how I kind of acquire an SMTP server. This is how I set it up, and I'm following a guide for this. But if something goes wrong, like to have that skill to kind of deviate from those plans, which it does in phishing, they're just not capable of that. So the mail tends to end up in spam or getting blocked by mail filters quite often.
Yeah, the other thing is, I think that the reason why there's such an overlap between the APT groups and then the script kiddies is because phishing works. We've seen that APT 28 GRU were using phishing to get hold of Podesta's email inbox using a Gmail password reset phish. So from that level down, there's a reason why, pick a number, whichever set of statistics you want to believe, but like 90%, something like this, of attacks, the initial intrusion, the initial access is gained through phishing. It works. It's reliable. So why would you do anything else?
Exactly. I mean, we've discussed it before. When you look at kind of infrastructure these days, I mean, there are still a lot of vulnerabilities out there, more and more coming out all of the time. But to actually guarantee an organization, if you're targeting a particular organization, to guarantee that they're going to be vulnerable to a particular exploit that's actually going to get you inside the network is unlikely. So the kind of exploitation side of things is great for opportunistic attackers. But targeted attackers, phishing is just the better way in, because if you can lay out your lures correctly, then you've got a good chance of success.
And the other thing is that phishing, especially spear phishing, so targeted phishing, gets you into a place where you want to be in the network. So if I spearphish a senior network admin, or a CEO or some top level person, or a person who has the access I'm interested in, I'm already in the right place.
Exactly.
If you're looking at the sort of outside in network scan, exploit, vulnerable WordPress, whatever, and you end up in some DMZ of some hosting provider, there's no real guarantee that that's particularly useful. Now, okay, you're technically inside of the corporate network, fine, but then the effort that you'll have to do to then pivot from that initial access point to something else, which is actually useful towards your actual goal, because the attackers have goals, they have things they want to achieve, they have objectives. So that, to me, is another good reason, which is often not really talked about so much, is why phishing is so great. Because if you're interested in the CEO's email, you phish the CEO, you'll be right there on their box with all of their emails just waiting for you.
Exactly. And as you say, the kind of pivoting or lateral movement side of things from the exploitation side takes a whole different skill set. So when you're looking at some of these phishers, sure, there are some groups out there that've got a mixed bag of skills, but there are also a lot of people out there who have learned how to fish, and they're using that as a way in to get onto a particular box to loot their mail, get all the contacts, and kind of sit inside that kind of mail chains. Whereas it does take a lot more skill and patience to perform lateral movement without actually being detected.
Okay, let's build on that. So, do any of you have an example of a phishing campaign or one that you particularly like that might demonstrate that at quite a sophisticated level, maybe? Richard, I know you quite enjoy the way Fin4 go about things.
Yeah, this is my favorite example of a phish to date. So this is from a FireEye report on a threat actor they call Fin4. And the subject of the email, which the target received, is called Employee Making Negative Comments About You and the Company. And the phish goes on to talk about that there's a user on a forum who is making very negative comments about the company that this person's supposed to be working for, the target's working for. And they talk about how the negative comments are about the company in general, that about executive compensation, so implying that the guy is overpaid. And then you in specific saying that you are overpaid and incompetent. I mean, this immediately is that's going to get people's backs up. That's such a vicious thing to start with. This is the first sentence. And then they are talking about, the guy, apparently this person on the forum is then talking about the details of why he's so upset. And then comes the kicker. In doing so, this is a direct quote, he may have unwittingly divulged confidential company information regarding pending transactions. And then the attacker goes on to say that they are a long-time client, and they say that this does not bode well for future business. And they said there's lots of people who read the post, there's lots of negative replies, lots of people agreeing. And of course, and then this is the very nice part, he says, while I understand that an employee has the right to his opinion, attempting to seem conciliatory and attempting to seem reasonable, and then he should have used the proper channels to deal with this. Here's the link to the post. And I think anyone working for a company who says that they would not click on that link is lying.
This also is actually my favorite example of a phishing campaign, the Fin4 style. They had it all in the bag there. I mean, they're kind of the first examples that I saw of using Outlook rules to kind of get themselves into the chain of emails and all sorts. And like a lot more people have mimicked that since. You're seeing that more and more with malware. But yeah, definitely my favorite example as well.
Yeah, I think social engineering wise, I think it's absolutely incredible. Even like the nation state stuff, they're like, okay, these military guys, and maybe they're attending a conference, so we'll just send them a document with macros enabled for advertising at conference, and then click, and then they're in. It works, yeah, and you can see that the lure is contextually relevant to the target. Yeah. But it doesn't have the same artistry as this does.
No, I think the psychological aspect of some of these, the more advanced phishing campaigns is really, really interesting. And that one, I think, is the key example of all of those kind of pressures in there. The urgency, the kind of the peer pressure and everything else. It just works. It's a prime example.
Is there something to say as well with Fin4? I mean, I think conventional wisdom is that they probably have people within their group as well who have worked in a lot of industries that they target. So they really know the right buttons to push, just in terms of what they talk about, business processes, the way they structure their emails. And then, like you said, the psychological element where they start with attack the reputation there, like go in with a slight like that. And immediately that person, it doesn't matter who they are, you're attacking their ego. So they're already gonna be on the defensive there and probably more vulnerable to these type of attacks.
Triggering this emotional state that immediately, if you've gone through the first sentence, people, as you say, they're going to be defensive, they're going to be angry, they're going to be upset, they're going to be emotional. So they're already destabilized. And then comes, the real like thrust of the knife, basically. So it's really, I mean, it's masterful. I mean, it's completely evil, but it's completely masterful.
Yeah, I mean, you get the other kind of financial APTs like Fin7 as well, who obviously they did a lot of phishing campaigns, and they use kind of contextual laws and backup phone calls to kind of say, hey, come on, you need to read your email because I've sent you this complaint or whatever else. But I think that particular Fin, for example, there was a lot more in there to kind of press someone's buttons, and I think that would get a lot of people.
Yeah. I think the Fin7 example is also pretty interesting, as you mentioned the usage of this additional channel, like the phone call and stuff like that. And I think that although it lacked somehow the artistry of the Fin4 campaigns, with Fin7, they did do things like looking for restaurants so they could say, oh, but somebody had food poisoning. And again, that kind of, I think the FARA nicknamed it fin digestion.
Yeah.
So like being able to like pick up what would be concerning for a particular organization. So they were very savvy, very aware about their targets. They'd obviously done their recon.
Yeah.
They knew what would be a concern to them, and they exploited that. So in the hotel one, it was a customer complaint that they weren't happy with the service and this kind of stuff. So by triggering these kind of negative emotions in people, they make them more susceptible to clicking on the link, opening the attachment, or whatever.
Yeah, and I think this is the key difference between some of the kind of, as Raf says, the novices or the kind of general invoice campaigns, just blanketing an organization or a list to try and get someone to click on it, to the actual proper APT style campaigns where they're doing a little bit of recon, or they know what is likely to be kind of acceptable as a context for the target, which is really interesting.
Another thing on that, actually, I think it was APT28, when some of the open source reporting, they've talked about that whilst the fishes were they were good, don't get me wrong, but they weren't this Fin4 level, but they were remarkably persistent. If there was somebody that they were interested in, they would just fish them for literally years until they got in. And that's something which I find almost even more scary, because it's one thing, like if a fish like that came in, and like the Fin4 fish, and there's a chance that maybe you had a good day, or maybe there was something that triggered the spam filter, or maybe there was something you had a very small chance, like a really small chance, but there's a chance. But when you flip it around and you look at this kind of almost industrial scale approach that they're just going to fish you for years, then you're having to say, I'm going to make 100% correct security decisions forever. Then that's not going to work.
No.
So briefly, another one of the techniques that we saw play heavily in the indictments was email spoofing. Again, tutorials and guides, we see criminals recommending this as an effective tactic. Simon, for the benefit of all of us, how would you best describe email spoofing?
So email spoofing is basically just mimicking a sender of an email. So normally, if you send out an email from your Outlook or whatever else, it's obviously got the from address being yourself or a joint mailbox. With email spoofing, it's basically a method of changing the from address to be of the person you want to mimic. So kind of an example, if I wanted to send an email from Digital Shadows, as an attacker, I can literally modify the information that I'm sending. So instead of actually having the domain from the SMTP server that was auto prefixed normally, I can actually add in a different domain on there or whatever I like. Now, there are problems with this. More and more kind of mail systems are starting to pick up where senders are supposed to be, where the emails are supposed to be coming from. But spoofing itself has been around for a long, long time, since SMTP kind of came out. And it's heavily used But the problem is, it still works in a lot of organizations as well. And there are issues around kind of, when you trust your own domain and stuff like this with certain mail providers, which I've found quite interesting. You can actually receive more of these spoofed messages from your own organization to your own organization. So it still works to some extent, but more and more mail providers are picking up on it and kind of identifying these as spam. So spoofing has its risks, and I think it has a bit more, not technical element to it, but it has a bit more tricks of the trade to actually pull it off correctly.
Going back to the Fin4 example, that email that was sent to the target was sent from a compromised company.
Right.
So it was a company that the target would have already known, would have probably already done business with, already had a relationship with, already had that kind of connection with, which would again make it even more than it already was, even more frightening. And I think part of the reason it was done that is for the legitimacy, of course, but also for the reason that Simon was just mentioning, that you probably could have spoofed it before in the past. Now that's not so easy as it used to be. So you're going to have to go the extra mile with your tradecraft to make sure that you've compromised the appropriate, second, level, third level supplier to be able to get into your primary target.
Yeah, I just think the whole kind of spoofing aspect is so heavily used, but it does increase the risk a lot. And I like I like the kind of compromise aspect of a trusted third party, because you're instantly in that kind of trust loop. And as I say, with spoofing, you do have kind of the protections like SPF and DKIM as well. DKIM being a kind of signature on outgoing emails from your trusted email senders for your domain, and SPF being a list that basically identifies the mail servers that are allowed to send on your behalf. But the problem is with kind of these configurations, they are down to the recipient, to how the recipient mail server to decide on how they handle those. So in most cases, they'll either just increment like a spam score and then put them into your spam box, or they will just end up in your inbox. And there are a lot more kind of complications to how you spoof an email, but the actual technical ability required to spoof an email is very, very minimal. So yeah, if your organization is susceptible to spoofing, or the clients of yours who are expecting emails from you and their mail servers are susceptible to spoofing, then it's quite an issue.
I know both of you can probably talk a lot longer on email spoofing. So what we'll do is in a later podcast, we'll do a deep dive on this topic and maybe go even more technical into particularly how practitioners can maybe combat email spoofing techniques. So we'll save that for a later date. Stay tuned for that. Now, another reminder that you can check out our research blog, which we've discussed today. It's called Tackling Phishing, the most popular phishing techniques and what you can do about it. And it's available on digitalshadows.com under the blog and resources section. Also, if you can spare the time and enjoy today's podcast, please give us a rating on iTunes or your podcast platform of choice. That would be greatly appreciated. Now, to finish off, phishing isn't going away anytime soon, as we've obviously discussed. So from each of you, what sort of mitigation advice would you recommend to individuals and organizations? We can't cover all of it now.
Yeah.
There's a few tips in the blog itself, but if you can pick out one or maybe two key fundamental principles, that would be great for today.
For me, I think kind of phishing mitigations itself is always going to come down to kind of security awareness training and education of your employees. As Rich said, it is social engineering at the end of the day. And if someone gives you the right context, then they're probably going to get through. But the best you can kind of do is kind of educate your employees to start looking for particular things within emails. Like when you look at that Fin4 example, there are a lot of aspects in there that kind of piled up where you've got that pressure. If you actually take time to look at the email and analyze it a bit before rushing into clicking a link to see what's going on, you kind of look over it a bit more. Maybe have a peer look over it as well. Holes start to kind of show in what's going on. And you can look at the headers, you can look for kind of redirects on the links or anything else. But at the end of the day, it is just down to kind of being a bit more savvy and taking time to look over the email correctly, and trying to make that decision on whether it's going to be genuine or not. It is a hard one to combat. And regarding the spoofing, obviously, as I touched on, there are some implementations such as SPF, DMARC, and DKIM, which are definitely worth kind of investigating further, which we can talk about another time.
Yeah, I think from my side, I like what you're saying, Simon, about how you evaluate if something is a phish or not. If something seems important, it's probably worth taking a bit of time to do it, to do your due diligence to really check it. And I really like your idea of getting a peer to check, because they might not be so emotionally triggered as you are and can maybe keep a cooler head. And I think that's something which is really important. I think the other thing is also about expectations. So often I find a good way to catch phishing is, were you expecting this? So in this case, like the Fin4 one, I'm pretty sure the target was not expecting the phish. And if it, there was not expecting an email from this person about this kind of issue, and then you can use that, maybe you give that person a call, right? And say, hey, what is this? Can you talk a little bit more about this? And I think we're very much pushed a little bit, I suppose, in this day and age to be, always responsive, always taking action. Sometimes it's good to not take action. Sometimes it's good to slow down. Sometimes it's good to actually double check. And as I say, if you weren't expecting something and something suddenly very, very urgent arrives, it might be worth having a second opinion from somebody else, or just simply taking the time yourself, wait till you've calmed down, And I think it's very funny and quite telling that when we're talking about cybersecurity advice, some of the best advice I could give you would be to take a 5-minute walk, go get a drink of water, come back, sit down, look at it again with a fresh pair of eyes. And if you feel like you're being manipulated, then that's something that's a big warning sign. And people often notice this, right? People are very sensitive. Everybody is. And, if your gut says, I don't like this, something feels wrong, then listen to it, ask somebody to help. You have a security team, talk to your security team, say, hey, I've got this thing. I just doesn't seem right. And, maybe it's a false positive, but maybe it isn't. And I think that's probably an okay way to start thinking about these things.
Great. Thank you very much for that, guys. I didn't think we could talk about phishing for so long, but it's been a great discussion. All right. Well, I want to thank my guests, Richard and Simon. Thanks again for joining.
Pleasure.
And thank you for listening. Join us once again next week for our final podcast of the year. Have a great week.